first start just by introducing myself and introducing, well, I'll let Celeste introduce herself as well. But firstly, my name is Paige. I'm a software engineer for a financial services company based in North Carolina. We created projects called SageWorks, but we make products for small banks, smaller financial institutions all across the United States, including like credit unions and stuff. And so that being said, I work with data a lot of the time, and the topic of databases, generally speaking, along with SQL, something that I work with, daily. Just since I've started working, period. So it's something I'm pretty familiar with. I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I'd certainly say that I learned a ton being there compared to when I started. And so hopefully the idea of this course is to just sort of suggest a lot of the stuff that I've learned, at least in an introductory sense, and hopefully you can kind of use some of the stuff that you learn here to kind of maybe explore some things on your own, hopefully some new things, and maybe for some of you that are a bit familiar, maybe some stuff that you didn't know was possible, or maybe that's new to you too. So I've been working with the library for almost, I think, a year now, actually, and it's been fantastic. We've done a couple different series, so this is just the latest. And I'll let Celeste, if you want to introduce yourself as well.
Thank you, Paige. And we're really happy to have you here. So I just want to mention that. So I'm Celeste, and I work at the New Haven Free Public Library, specific in the Ives Square department. And like Paige said, we've been running this series almost a year now. It's really crazy. And this is kind of like the third session we have. The first one was for more to learn to code. The second one was based on that on apps, and this one is based on databases. So welcome, Paige, again. Thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. And Paige, before you want to start, if you want to mention your office hours, which I think they're very important and helpful for patrons.
Yes, absolutely. So before we continue, certainly we'll want to advertise that I have office hours. I have office hours every Monday from 6:30 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. Split up into 4 different blocks. So you can go to, actually, why don't I just start sharing my screen, and we can kind of go from there, because I'll show you where you can sign up for those office hours. And I'll also show you my email as well. Okay, so let's see here. So I'm going to share my screen. Do that. Let's see. Okay. Oops. Close that. And close this. Oh, it's the one I just had open. Oh, did I close it? Ah, I did. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so if you want to reach my office hours, you can go to Calendly and then Coder NHFPL. So I just had it already been here before. So if you go to this website, you'll see if you just do /Coder NHFPL, and I'll post a link to this on our sort of like class hub with where all of the lesson plans will sort of be. So you can go here and you can click on a date. So the next one coming up is next week, and you can just select the block. And if you select this, I'll get an email and you'll get a Zoom link, and then we can join via Zoom and we can talk about whatever you need to talk about. I mean, besides databases, like anything with code, I can certainly try my hand at. Yeah, so it can help with anything related to the course or any other kind of coding kind of like problems of interest. And then also, I'll now show you the homepage for the class.
I did share the link on the chat.
Oh, yes, that's a good idea.
Calendly. Yes, and
yes.
I just want to mention that if you guys have any questions, please just put it in the chat or raise your hand, and we're going to try to answer all the questions as soon as possible. Or you can also speak up and just unmute yourself.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think I want to say that I want to say that's the email too, that I just sent to the chat. So that email you can reach me, you can use to reach me and just ask any questions there. Like if you don't want to do like a formal meeting or something like that, you can always just email me and I should be able to get back to you. But I just wanted to confirm that that's the case. Yeah, coder@nhfpl.org. And this is just from the last series. I've already set one up for this series. I just need to add that information here, but I will do that so that way you always have kind of a place to go with that kind of information. Okay, so getting started. If anyone, I mean, if you want to follow along, you don't have to. That's totally fine. I'll be basically following along from here today. If you want to follow along with today's kind of lesson structure, then you can go to github.com/Page Swanson/library-SQL, because we'll be learning about SQL and databases. And so basically, if you go into this lessons folder, you'll see the first session. And so that's what I'm going to be working from today. So it's got a bunch of helpful links and things like this, and just basically what we're going to try to cover and discuss today. Okay, so yeah, let's go ahead and get started. I always try to start each session with like kind of like a resource that you can use or that I found pretty interesting relating to either what we're going to cover upcoming or just something that's just useful. So I found this resource called Learn X in Y Minutes, and it actually has a bunch of different tools available or kind of like guides available for all different kinds of things. So this is like a really great resource. I kind of occasionally like to introduce it. I mean, nearly anything you can think of in all kinds of languages from around the world, you can learn about basically like a quick kind of rundown, mostly for syntax. So syntax being like the way that you build your code that you're trying to write. Certain languages have certain syntaxes that you need to adhere to. And so this is a really great way of giving an overview of not only what the language that you're working with is for, but also just very simple syntax and very simple commands or sentences in that language for you to use in case you need like a quick reference for something like this. And this covers actually quite a lot of different, what we're going to learn are called queries that are actually pretty useful, generally speaking, like when you're working with databases. And actually, I believe most of the things in this we'll be covering throughout the sessions. So there's not too many things that I would leave out from this in what we cover coming up. So this is just pretty cool. And it also just kind of gives some helpful links for additional learning. So this is a really good resource. So I just wanted to kind of show that. Okay, so moving on. So since this is the first session in the series, I just wanted to give an idea of like what we'll try to cover or what we anticipate addressing. And the first part, aside from what we're going to do today, which is just kind of break down a lot of the higher level concepts that you may be unfamiliar with if you don't know what SQL is or what databases are. We'll be introducing SQL queries. So this is basically, this syntax that you're seeing here. These are SQL queries. We'll be introducing, databases in a sense. So like we'll try to understand like what a database actually is, like what purpose it serves, and we'll try to also work on modifying some of our own databases. We'll introduce some more complex queries that go a little bit beyond just some of these first kind of primary examples here. And then finally, if the sessions get to where I'd like them to, just depends on how much time we want to spend on certain concepts in SQL, then we'll try to use our database in code, which I think hopefully a lot of you were inspired about, or maybe why you might be intrigued by databases is ultimately we want to use the data that we are organizing with our databases in code that we write for all kinds of different purposes. But I think what I'd like to target is possibly setting up a very simple website using just our computer, and then get that website to read from our database that we've configured. So if we can get that working, that would be a pretty exciting goal for the class, I think. Okay, so getting into kind of like the main topic, like what is SQL? You know, I don't know how many people in here have heard about SQL, but it might be interesting. If you want to, or if you feel inclined, feel free to post in the chat, like just if you have or have not heard about SQL, just to get kind of a survey, and I can kind of check back in on that, just to get an idea of how many people have actually heard of SQL before or know kind of what they're getting into. And if not, this class is totally geared towards that, so that's totally fine. So SQL, the way I put it here, hopefully is kind of a useful way to put it, but it provides us a way to build sentences. SQL stands for, in particular, it's a structured query language. So we can see that here in Wikipedia. It's a structured query language. And Wikipedia goes on to say that it's, domain-specific language used in programming and designed for managing data held in a relational database management system. I'll kind of stop there because the rest gets a little bit wordy, but these kind of two parts are pretty key, or three parts maybe I'd say. So it's a domain-specific language. It's used in programming and it's designed for managing data. And that data is held in a relational database management system. So what we're talking about when we talk about SQL, especially in the context of this class, is with respect to relational databases. The point of relational databases is basically that they present data in an organized manner, and it's all pretty much organized in the same way, which we'll talk about a little bit later when we get into databases. But we're going to use SQL in order to build sentences that basically ask questions about that data. And that, I mean, you should probably be pretty familiar with the term query, I assume, right? Like you can query something, or you can have a query about something. And that's really what we're doing when we use SQL. We are asking questions about data right here, but not always just asking questions about it. We might also want to use a sentence to delete data. We might want to update existing data that we already know about, introduce new data, so add data to our database. We might want to relate data to other data. So I might build a sentence that looks something like, what is in here and what is in here, and where do those two things like line up? So I can make sentences like that using SQL, and it gives me a tool for basically figuring out particular things about the data that I've stored in my database. But you can also filter on data, which would basically look like, like if I had a sentence that was like, where is the data that doesn't have this and this and this? Or where is the data that only has this? Like things like that we can do with SQL pretty effectively. And again, these things are called queries, these sentences, when we're using something like SQL. And this Wikipedia page just has, I mean, it's a little bit technical, I would say, but things like this syntax article, the syntax portion of the article are pretty useful. It kind of breaks down. Actually, this might look something similar or like familiar to you if in grade school, if you remember learning about grammar, you had to do these like sentence trees. This is exactly what SQL is all about. It's about building sentences with clauses, expressions and predicates, and then the queries are composed of these things. So let's close out of here. And I just wanted to include this Wikipedia page here on the select statement. So the select statement it's probably the most, widely, I don't know, accessible or useful query generally speaking. I mean, it's not any more useful than anything else, but it's just, it's kind of the first thing you think of when you think of a query. It basically asks a database, for this portion of the database, I would like this piece of data, or I would like this block of data, or I'd like all of the data from this portion of the database in particular. So the select is going to be pretty powerful, and we're going to learn about all of the different things that you can use with the select. In particular, things like the where clause, which will allow us to filter We're going to learn in particular about, how to do each of these things using the select, and then these will require some additional queries. But just for now, hopefully this gives you an idea overall of like what a query is. And I'll just check the chat. Well, let me finish this section and then I'll check the chat again to see kind of what our survey looks like. And I just wanted to clarify, with SQL, that SQL is not only just like a concept. So there's a concept of SQL, like a standard query language, or sorry, a structured query language, my mistake. There's this concept of SQL, not only as an idea, but also as a standard. So SQL is, when we refer to SQL, what we're really referring to is the standard behind SQL or SQL. I just realized I'd been saying SQL, and hopefully you picked up that that is SQL. A lot of people just say SQL. So yeah, just to be clear there. SQL has a standard behind it, and a standard is basically saying, like, if you want to use SQL, or let's say I myself, for example, were to go and try to make my own structured query language, I could make it do whatever I wanted to, but that wouldn't be very useful to people necessarily. And the reason being is because all of these infrastructures or systems that use SQL try to conform in some manner to this standard, which we can see here effectively. If I click this, you can see there's been a stable release of SQL as of 2016. So basically what this represents is like the revised standard, which the newest version being in 2016. And what this is doing is it's laying out basically everything that you can do in using SQL. You can think of this kind of like, the standards for, or trying to think of a good standard. Maybe I'm kind of thinking of like sports. That's maybe not the best analogy, but it works okay. So if you think of something like basketball, there are standards or rules that are part of basketball, and every year they assess them and maybe revise them. And you can play basketball otherwise, I guess, but conforming to the standards is helpful because everyone agrees on what the rules are and what happens. This is basically how SQL is kind of working, so to speak. And what we're going to find is that there's actually a bunch of different implementations of that standard. So jumping down here really quick, you'll see all these different references and names that you may have come across or may have heard of, things like PostgreSQL, MySQL, Microsoft SQL Server, SQL Lite, maybe even some others that I didn't list here. These are all what are considered implementations of the SQL standard. So, there's the SQL standard, and then other people say, well, I'd like to implement my own version of SQL. They basically agree to do all of the things that are required by the standard, but they might add their own additional features or things like that. And usually these implementations end up contributing to the standard. So basically they'll introduce something new that's pretty agreeably like pretty exciting. And so maybe the SQL standards committee or that group that works on those standards, they might agree to incorporate some of those things into the SQL standard revisions, which it probably was done a lot like with this. So these you can see are like new features that were added to the standard in 2016. And I'm sure that coming up, we're going to have a new standard revision. It looks like it happens, here it looks like about every 5 years or so, though this was a little faster. So yeah, maybe we have one coming. Maybe we have one coming in 2021. We'll see. Okay. So that being said, let's check the chat. I might see just to get an idea. Okay. So we have some people saying that they've heard of it, but they haven't used it, and they created a database. So I think that does seem to be a common thing for a lot of people. Like a lot of people, you can use certain interfaces or certain technologies to create databases, but you don't necessarily need to use SQL for. Like Microsoft Access is a great example where we can use tools provided by Microsoft to kind of circumvent the need to write queries. And that's really great too. That's really, really common, I think, now in a lot of cases. So it looks like we also have some people. So Peter here is worked on SQL. That's awesome. So good, a lot of big range of experience here. So yeah, that's awesome. Haven't heard of SQL. Yeah, that's awesome. That's great. Okay, cool. So good information. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to address beyond, so now we kind of have an idea of what SQL is. We know it's a standard, and it's a standard for a structured query language. We know there are different implementations of it. And we know, generally speaking, it allows us to build queries, which allow us to do all sorts of things with data. And that's the big goal here, is like writing out sentences, or basically programming instructions or sentences for retrieving data or filtering data, doing things with data. Okay, so I just wanted to address a couple of common implementations, because I think this is probably what people have like heard of or might be familiar with. I linked their Wikipedia pages here in most cases, but I won't go too deep into those. But just to kind of cover them, generally speaking, these I would say are the most popular. If I've maybe forgotten one or anything like that, and that you thought maybe was, feel free to chime into the chat again, because I think that information is pretty interesting. In particular, PostgreSQL is probably, if I'm remembering correctly, it's like the second most popular out there, and it's actually growing in popularity, followed by MySQL, or I'm sorry, second only to MySQL, being, which I believe is the most popular. So both of these, again, are just different SQL implementations. Some of them do different things. Both of them are open source and multi-platform. So this means, like, if you work on SQL at a company, or you want to start your own database, some things to think about, or some concerns you might have, is whether or not you need to have like a certain operating system in order to use that implementation of SQL. And so a lot of these are trying to become what would be considered like multi-platform, in order to support more people, so that they'll use their implementation of SQL. And where I work, we use Microsoft SQL Server. So we use a lot of different Microsoft products, and this has its own advantages. It includes something like it's called T-SQL, or Transact SQL. This actually extends what normal SQL does, and it adds more sort of like tools and syntax for interacting with databases specifically. And maybe we'll encounter that later, but it's not super important to know, especially when you're starting off. Another thing, though, that it does is has really good integration with the C# coding language, which is also developed by Microsoft. Similarly, I imagine MySQL, since it's made by Oracle, or it's owned by Oracle anyway, so the Oracle Corporation, they kind of like run Java, or they develop and continue to like improve the Java programming language. So I'm assuming that MySQL may have some advantages if you're using Java in particular. But the last one that I wanted to bring up, which is the one that I think we're going to use for this class, or I'm pretty confident we will, and there's a number of reasons why I think it's pretty powerful. It's called SQL Lite, or Sqlite, or however you'd like to call it. And the particular reason why I think SQL Lite is pretty powerful is because basically it's very small. The implementation is as basically as small as it can be. And in fact, you'll note here on Wikipedia, it says it implements most of the SQL standard. So it doesn't even implement all of the SQL standard. It actually just implements a subset of it. But that's perfect for us, since we're learning about, we're learning about SQL, and we don't need everything that SQL has to offer, though it's certainly going to get us pretty far. And that's not to say that SQL Lite is some like kind of basic or like tutorial version of SQL. That's certainly not the case. It's used actually quite widely, and one of the great or pretty significant uses of it is actually in embedded systems on mobile phones. And the reason for that is because the implementation is so small. Here it's saying that all of the code needed to run a SQLite database, essentially, aside from the database itself, which the database can be as large as you want it to be, depending on how much data you add. The implementation itself is only 699 kilobytes, I think is what this is, or kilobytes. Either way works. So it's basically 699,000 bytes, which is not that big, really, in the grand scheme of things. I don't know if the size is advertised for other versions of SQL as readily, probably because they're a lot bigger. Yeah, it doesn't look like they are. They probably don't really want to tout how large their implementation is. But yeah, SQLite is pretty fantastic for that reason. But on top of that, the databases that you create, and this is the reason why I wanted to use it for this session, is actually, I wonder if it'll mention the file. Well, yeah, pretty much. Basically, the database that we're going to make with SQLite is just stored in a little file. So we just store it in a file. You can store that file anywhere. You can put the file here on like Dropbox or something, or you can put it on like Google Drive. So yeah, it stores the entire database, everything you need, which is not typically the case at all. Usually like an implementation for like PostgreSQL or MySQL, it's going to store multiple files in order to build and organize all of the data that you have to like kind of represent all of those complex relationships you have across multiple files, multiple directories. SQLite just uses one file. And yeah, it locks the entire database file during writing, which just basically means if you're using the database, no one else can use it. That's kind of a big disadvantage. But other than that, it's pretty great, especially for small applications where there's only one thing happening at a time. So it's really great for learning for that reason. You can take your database anywhere, so to speak. So as long as you have SQLite available to you, you can query the database. So this is pretty cool. This is pretty powerful, and so that's why I like it. It's also open source, and I wanted to just show this page really quick here. It has good interface support, meaning that a lot of different programming languages. And I'll actually just Google really quick just to show you an example, which I hope we'll be able to use in this series using Python. Python has a really great SQLite or SQLite implementation. It's very easy to use. You simply basically just do this. This is really all you need to do. You import the library of code that you use to interface with SQLite, and then you connect to your database file. Remember the single file that I mentioned, and that's all you have to do, and you can begin writing code to interface with your database. We're not going to get to that quite yet, but you can see maybe this might start to look not familiar, but like, oh, you might recognize this as a query. We can write code to actually execute queries in place using Python. And there's all kinds of languages that have support for SQLite as well. Yeah, it's great for that reason, and it's very simple to get started with. So I just wanted to show this page that I linked. If you go back to the session notes, it's this link here. So SQLite, they posted this really nice page. It also looks like they have a competitor, which I didn't know about. That's kind of cool. Competes with. Oh, they're kind of being cheeky there. I won't get into that, but it's kind of funny. So they kind of describe, like, I guess really, succinctly, for people that are newcomers, why would I want to use SQLite versus one of these more robust implementations of SQL, where they're implementing the complete standard. Maybe it's bigger, but maybe I want that like scale. Maybe I want to do complex things eventually. Maybe I want to scale effectively. So they kind of like work to demonstrate to you like why you should use it and why you should not. So I think this article is really great, and it represents some of the things that I think like a lot of people coming to SQL fresh would find appealing about it. Certainly things like embedded devices. So if you want to make an app, or you want to make something small, like just a simple device that needs to store some data and look it up later, these are all really great examples of things that you could like maybe work on yourself or independently, and you could use SQLite for this, especially for something like mobile. Skipping down to like websites. Websites are a really great use case for SQLite. If you're just doing simple stuff, you want to manage it yourself, you can make SQLite work for you pretty effectively. They're saying though that, keep in mind, like something like Twitter isn't going to use SQLite. They have a lot of data input and output. And, that being said, I guess they're touting that their website in particular handles about 400,000 plus requests every day. And they're doing pretty well with SQLite. So that's pretty interesting, actually, that they're doing this, managing this infrastructure with just SQLite. So that's pretty impressive. Yeah, things like data analysis, where you want to work on a small set of data. I mean, there's tons of examples of things like why you'd want to use it, especially like for temporary databases. We use it at work actually for temporary databases. Yeah, so there's tons of reasons why you might want to use it. Of course, education and training. It's just a simple setup, I think, is a really great reason. And then it goes in to talk about like why you wouldn't want to use SQL. So again, things that you could expect, like high volume websites, like something like Twitter, very large data sets. That would be something like also like Twitter. They just have a ton of data, or like Reddit. Places like this, high concurrency, meaning like there's a lot of people trying to touch the database at the same time. They're trying to send data and retrieve data all at the same time. This might not be an ideal situation for SQLite. It's not going to necessarily perform very well. But in cases where you need to write a lot of data and you need the data back immediately, it may not be the best case. And they kind of go down into, maybe some conditions on whether you should or shouldn't use it too. So I think this is a pretty great article, and definitely, if you're considering using SQL for a project, you should definitely evaluate SQLite, because it's just so easy to use and it's pretty basic to set up. So a little bit late into the lesson, but oh, did I mess up this database link? Oh, I did. Whoops. I think I have it. Yeah, I do here. It's just the Wikipedia link to the article on databases. Not that we really particularly need that, but I think that it's kind of a good idea to get an overall view of like what a database is, because we've talked a lot about databases, even just in this short amount of time where we've covered some of this information. But in particular, I think it's useful to understand like what we are referring to when we say database. That's probably the word also that you've encountered the most, just like learning sort of casually possibly about databases, generally speaking, is or learning about coding, learning about programming, like what is a database. This is not loading. I'm not sure why. That's interesting. Maybe this will load. Hopefully everyone can still hear me. Am I still being heard?
We are still with you.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
We see.
Great. Okay. Well, yeah, I'm not sure. Wikipedia is down. That would surprise me. In any event, yeah, I mean, basically, I tried to describe really what's going on with the database here. So in essence, what a database is, it's a structure for keeping data. I mean, that sounds pretty simple, but the way that a database maintains data differs depending on the implementation and the way you want to use that data. When we talk about using SQL, we're usually talking about a relational database. So a relational database has some additional constraints that make it kind of what it is, a relational database. And these are just a few of those things in particular. So a relational database is going to maintain a schema. A schema is effectively a sort of like a high-level description or a high-level map, if you will, of a database itself. It provides constraints on like what kind of data can be stored where. It provides names and identifiers for tables within the database. So we'll find that relational databases specifically use a structure of tables. And then within those tables, we have columns. I mean, I won't say that it'll always help you, but a lot of the time, like more than half the time, certainly, you can typically be helped by thinking about a database table as like a spreadsheet. It's not the most useful analogy, and it breaks down a little bit when you try to do some complex things or try to relate data. In that way, it's a little bit more helpful to think of it a little bit differently. But generally speaking, you can think of a database as a collection of tables, which kind of would look like spreadsheets if you want to visualize them in your head that way. And then each of those spreadsheets, as I'm sure most everyone here has probably used Excel or seen it before in some capacity. And if you haven't, well, dang. Maybe I'll just Google a database table. Let's see. This is so odd. It's definitely not just Wikipedia then. Well, I'm going to ignore it for now. I don't know why I can't get to any website, but I'm glad everyone can still hear me. So, yeah, I'd like to pull up a visualization of some kind, which is what this article had. But basically, if you think of just like a table as a spreadsheet, and again, if you're not familiar with spreadsheets, I'm sorry, but it's basically like a sheet or like a just like a page, and that page has columns. So columns going vertically, and then it has rows going horizontally, and each column, typically the way we read a spreadsheet of some kind, the top of the column will tell us kind of like, well, what kind of data is in this column, or what's the label for that data, what's the identifier. Like let's say it's something like a color, so we might have a data column for color, and then each of those rows contains the specific instance of that like piece of data. So if we had columns like color and shape, things that are a little less vague, I don't know, flavor or something like that, each row would represent an instance of data that has those properties. So again, without the visualization, I'm a little bit stifled. I'm not sure why I'm struggling so much. I really wish we had one, because I think that would be really nice to see. But it's not the end of the world. Three-dimensional spreadsheet, Peter says. Yeah, that's actually a really good way to put it. When we get to, and I like that analogy, especially because what we need to do once we have our schema, so if we think of our schema as describing all these different spreadsheets and how they relate to each other, really, when we get down to like multiple tables of data and trying to relate them, we can think of that as like a multi-dimensional spreadsheet. So some of the data in our spreadsheet, some of those columns I mentioned, like flavor or color or shape, they might have another table that they reference for each instance of data in that table. So let's say we have something that's blue and it's shaped like a box and it tastes like candy. I don't know why we would have something like this, but maybe we do. Maybe though, the data isn't easily observed just by itself in that row. And what we might want to do is have another table that we relate to kind of demonstrate all the different possible flavors that we can select from for that piece of data. That's, again, a little bit complex if I try to demonstrate that just by talking. But I have something. Ooh, you know what I can do? If everyone's on their computer, I have a link. I I want to say, oh, I wrote it down. What I might do is just share it on this page afterwards, once I can get my internet working normally again. DB, shoot, it was called, yeah, maybe, yeah, I don't know what's going on with that. Anyway, I found this tool that I encountered at work that basically lets you visualize these complex sort of spreadsheet or like table relationships, spreadsheet-like table relationships very quickly using just the browser, the web browser. So it lets you build tables. You don't use SQL to build the tables, but you use something that's kind of SQL-alike. So yeah, maybe what I'll do is kind of include that tool next time, or I'll cite that tool at the beginning of the next session, and hopefully we can take a look. But the last thing I wanted to address is, of course, that the schema is what helps us define or organize those different tables of data inside of that database. It does so just by describing tables, columns, and rows, rows being within those tables, but it also describes things like types of data. So that means that basically every row with each of its columns in the row. So when we talked about things, for example, like shape, color, and flavor, we in our schema would also define a type of data for each of those columns. So we'd say, for example, if we wanted to store a number like quantity in that same table, we would describe that quantity as having a type in most implementations of SQL databases. So that type in that case would be an integer. So quantity would be of an integer type. So again, this would be a little bit more helpful with the visualization. So I'm terribly sorry about that. But maybe next time at the front of the class, we can try to look over that, just so that you can all get a visualization of the stuff that I'm talking about a little more clearly. Okay, so now that we're at the end, really what I wanted to do is introduce some things that if you get a chance, if you could get set up with them before the next class, because these things will help you as we move along, if you want to follow along. Again, there's no expectation that you follow along with the class itself, because I'll be moving relatively quickly if I can. So, that being said, you should definitely try out some of this stuff, or seek out, some of these kind of like concepts that we're learning, so that you can implement them yourself as we cover them, because I think that will be really helpful in learning. So the main thing that you're going to need is a good text editor. A text editor like this one, which I didn't recommend necessarily, because it's not the most simple text editor to work with in most cases, but it gets the job done for me, and I like it. But basically, I can use it as an example to show what you need it for. So basically, this is going to let me edit text. It's going to highlight the text based on the type of file that I'm using. And namely, what we can do is something like this. So if I do, let's do, so this is just an empty file. And if I save this, ignore all of the goofy syntax that I'm doing at the bottom here. If I just save this to like, let's just go to downloads. So I'm just going to save this file to downloads, and I'll call it something like scratch.sql. So I'm saving a SQL file. Oh, it wants to do an update, actually. Maybe the update will be fast and will happen in the background. Let's not use this editor. I have installed one of the editors that I recommended to you, just so that in the future, if you want to follow along with the kind of editor I'm using, I also have one of the ones I recommended. So the first one I recommended is just called Atom. It's a really nice text editor. It's open source. It's developed by a community of people that also work on GitHub. It's a really great editor. It's very fast. It's user friendly. And it also has just out of the box support for a lot of different tools and languages and different technologies. So it's pretty great for that. But the main things that you're going to get out of an editor, which across the board, all of these things will do, is syntax highlighting. So it'll kind of indicate to you, for the most part, when a sentence that you've created or a statement that you've created with a programming language is kind of like incorrect or not fully like fully correct, I guess. Yes, is the best word I have for it. But it'll also tell you helpful things, like it's possible that you can set it up to make suggestions for you. So as you write code, it can make suggestions. It can make suggestions for the code that you're writing, so that you don't have to write every single little piece of code out. And it can make suggestions if you just forget what something is called, or you just want to work more quickly. My computer is not handling having both open at once, but hopefully that will open up in the background. So all of these will do, all of those things. If you're using Windows, I tried to recommend one that a lot of people use for Windows. It's called Notepad++. Oh, my internet finally loaded. Maybe it's just because I downloaded this page earlier, but at least we get a visual example of what I expect from a text editor. So you can see here, this is a CPP file. So it's they're editing C++. And what it's doing is highlighting or coloring or whatever you want to call it, the syntax, the specific pieces of syntax that you use while coding in C++. So this is highlighted differently from this. And this is it's a useful color coding while you're working, because what you don't want to do is just, wow, I guess I'll keep waiting. But it's, oh goodness, I opened like 8 of them. Maybe that's why. Okay, let's take a breather and just quit that in the meantime. Yeah, my internet is just not really participating today. Okay, well, we don't really need that to proceed. I'm glad Notepad++ open. So you can see here, it kind of breaks down some of the stuff that it's capable of doing, but this is the main thing. What you don't want is like a word processor, like something like Microsoft Word for editing code, because it will never indicate to you whether something is using the correct syntax, and it won't indicate you special keywords that are used in the language that you're trying to write code for. And this is something that's not very helpful. You really, oh, well, we got one. Okay, well, I just closed them all. Sorry for the rough start. I did not expect my computer to be so cantankerous. But this appears to have worked. So I can just show you in this editor. So what I'm going to be able to do is basically show you how it would work for something like SQL. So I'm going to make a select statement here just to give you a quick example. I'm not going to run it on anything. I don't have a database set up to do that. But what I want to show you is something that a text editor will do when it's recognized a certain file type. So I can say something like select star from my fake table where my fake column is equal to my fake data, my fake, I don't know, column value, something like that. It doesn't really matter what I'm querying on, because what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that using this text editor, since it knows that I'm editing a SQL file, which is down here at the bottom left, so I've saved this as a SQL file. It said, oh, okay, you're trying to use SQL. I will do, I will highlight the syntax for you, and I'll kind of indicate even when it's not working. So like, for example, I would expect this to be highlighted blue, but because I messed up the syntax, it's not going to do that. It's helpful things like this that you kind of need when you're writing out code like this, especially SQL. In SQL, like syntax is very important, and it's going to get us from A to B. So you really do need a tool that's going to help you along rather than kind of like hinder you. Yeah, and I just will show, of course, I mean, I don't think I really need to show this example, but you know, if I just start, you know, doing it in a file that I haven't saved the file type for yet, you know, it's not highlighting anything. It's just working like Microsoft Word. It doesn't know what language I'm trying to write in. It can't guess. So I have to save the file and tell it, hey, this is a SQL file. Like I mentioned here, I gave a couple of other examples of text editors. Sublime Text is another big one that a lot of people like to use. It's saying download for Mac here, but you can use it on Windows as well. It's not just specifically for Mac. Notepad++, I think, is specifically for Windows. So if you have Mac or Linux, or yeah, like Mac or Linux, you'll want to use either Atom or Sublime Text or whatever your preference is if you just happen to have one. Okay, last thing that I want to cover is DB Browser. So this is like one of the main tools that we'll be using for each of the sessions. DB Browser is going to let us, oh, and I just want to note Peter's chat here. When a word processor is used, formatting is added to syntax that is not. That's also super true. Yeah, that's a really good point, Peter. So we didn't get too much into that, but yeah, like if you use a word processor, you don't want things like bolding or underlining and things like this to come from something that you did. The only time your text editor should be bolding or underlining is if there's a particular piece of syntax that it decides to indicate as special or important or significant with a bold or a highlight. And I think you would find these things as you start to use a text editor. It'll do some formatting for you to help you read the code better. And that's the whole point of it, is just to help you read code more quickly. And this doesn't work again. I don't know what's going on there, but definitely check these out on your own time. Try to install one of them, whichever one you either think looks the nicest or it works for you. You could certainly try out the one that I'm using, but I just wouldn't necessarily recommend it for you know, someone that's not familiar with either what are called Vim or Emacs, which are just different editors. They're just, you know, they're pretty powerful, but they're over time they take kind of some learning. Whereas these are pretty easy right out of the box, so I can highly recommend them. Yeah, so I wanted to mention just the last tool, which if you can get it set up before the next session and start playing around, that would be great, but don't feel obliged. But I will not kind of like cover the installation of this tool. I will just, you know, kind of begin using it for the session, in particular to start demonstrating how queries work with just like a sample database. So if you go to this link here, which again isn't going to work for me because for some reason my internet doesn't work, then you'll see on this page, if you scroll down, you'll see instructions for setup for Mac, Linux, and Windows. It's pretty easy to set it up for either of those platforms. Yeah, like it shouldn't be too bad. If you do have any trouble, just feel free to send me an email and I can try to help you out in getting it set up. There's also this, which basically walks you through, again, I can't open it. I don't know why I keep trying. This is going to walk you through basically like once you've installed the SQLite browser, the DB browser, you can then use these like this tutorial to kind of show you some different ways of interacting with DB browser to interact with the sample database. And we'll do some of that stuff in the sessions ahead, but you're welcome to like just explore and see if you can kind of do it on your own too, to learn more. So the next session, we're at the end here, but it looks like we just made it in. So we're going to learn about using select queries, so the one that I kind of introduced very briefly, to find data in a sample database. And then we'll try to filter on that data using where clauses based on what's in the database. We'll try to filter the data. We'll try to do a couple of other operations using selects to get some more mileage out of the data that we already have in our sample database. So that's kind of it for today's session. Yeah, I think the only things I needed to do were I'll include the link to that visualization tool for visualizing databases. And I think that's it. Yeah. Does anyone have any like questions they want to ask before the session ends, or does anyone want to, I don't know, like have any input or anything like that? Anything that maybe was confusing that I can elaborate on? Anything like that? Let's see. Okay.
Where is the basic the database that you spoke of? Where is all that located?
Oh yeah, so this website, if I could get it to load, which I can't, I believe they introduce a sample database that you can start working with. So yeah, if you want to follow that tutorial, what I'll probably do is in the next week, we'll have a session not next week, but the week after. I don't know if by the way, I don't know if I mentioned that at the top, but these sessions will be every other week. And I have office hours every Monday. So what I'll do is I'll probably post a sample database. Again, SQLite is great because I can just post a file. I will post it to this page here, the library SQL page, which again, I don't know why I keep thinking that I'm going to be able to click around. I will post it here so that you can check it out, and I'll try to do that in this coming week. So if you get a chance, you can download that one, but also I believe this tutorial will cover downloading some sample data for you. So yeah, May 25th is the date of the next session.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, well, if no one else has any questions, thanks for joining. And I hope to see you next time, where we'll actually get into kind of interacting with the database using some queries. So
thank you so much, Paige, again. And I was gonna say we had about 12 people between Zoom and Facebook Live. So
oh, great, that's awesome.
Today's session, yes.
Awesome, really cool.
All right. Okay, thank you. Good night, everybody.
All right, thanks.